Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we are opening the door on a piece of literature that, well, it contains arguably one of the most jarring and memorable opening sentences ever written.
Oh, absolutely. You mean Gregor Samsa waking up?
Exactly. The moment the traveling salesman Gregor Samsa wakes up, having been transformed overnight into an Ungeheursungeziefer.
Right, that phrase, Ungeheursungeziefer, I mean, it just hits you. It really sets the tone for everything that follows, doesn't it?
It really does.
It's usually translated as a monstrous vermin or maybe an unclean pest, but the power of those words, it's that they immediately throw you into the bizarre, the terrifying, yes, but also, and this is crucial, I think, into a moral context.
A moral context. How so?
Well, it's about disgust, right? Not just, oh, it's a weird bug, it's unclean. It signals rejection from the start, not just a biological shift.
That's a great point. So Franz Kafka's 1915 novella, The Metamorphosis, it pretty much defines what we call the Kafkaesque. But like you said, to really get it, we need to move way beyond just the initial shock of, the insect body.
Exactly. If you just treat this story as, I don't know, surrealism for its own sake, you completely miss the really profound philosophical blueprint that's lying just beneath the surface.
Right. And that's really our mission in this deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah.
We want to use the metamorphosis as like a lens.
Central text, yeah. For exploring 20th century existential thought. We'll be kind of channeling the core ideas of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, maybe Søren Kierkegaard too, looking for those moments, those nuggets of insight.
The aha moments.
Yeah, the aha moments. The ones that connect Gregor's really strange predicament to the fundamental questions of identity, of meaning that, let's face it, still kind of haunt modern life for a lot of us.
Definitely. So we've sort of identified 4 core themes in the source material that can act as anchors for this whole existential discussion. We're going to unpack this by looking at alienation first, then absurdity, then the whole crisis of identity, and finally, maybe the trickiest one, bad faith.
That concept of bad faith, yeah, it's a really insidious one. It'll be interesting to unpack that in Gregor's context.
Okay, so before we really dive deep into Gregor Samsa's tragedy itself, maybe we need to understand the man who imagined him, Franz Kafka. What was his own life like? How did his context, his world, become the sort of raw material for these existential narratives?
Oh, Kafka's personal history is absolutely the key. It unlocks so much in his fiction, I think. He was born in 1883 in Prague, which back then was a really crucial city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right, a real crossroads.
Exactly. And he came from a German-speaking Jewish family, middle class. So already you have the sense of being a minority within a minority, which probably fostered, an initial sense of isolation right from the start.
And his professional life? I mean, it seems almost like a perfect, if maybe grim metaphor for the kind of anonymous, alienating modern bureaucracy he wrote about later, like in The Trial.
That's a really good way to put it. Despite this deep literary drive he had, he was actually trained as a lawyer, got his law degree in 1906.
A lawyer? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, but instead of, pursuing some glamorous legal career, he ended up right in the thick of industrial modern life. He worked full-time, mostly in legal and insurance jobs. His most notable position was at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia.
Wow. The Workers' Accident Insurance Institute? That sounds, it sounds pretty bleak, but also maybe incredibly revealing.
Yeah.
About that disconnect between humanity and industry.
It was definitely exhausting and, revealing. His actual job was to investigate and assess compensation claims for injured industrial workers. Think about that for a second.
Okay.
He spent his entire day dealing with the often gruesome fallout of modern machinery. We're talking lost fingers, lost limbs, severe injuries, things that were pretty common back then because safety policies were, lax, to put it mildly.
So he's face to face with the physical vulnerability of people under this sort of cold industrial economic calculation every single day.
Every single day. He was basically documenting the human cost of a machine-driven world. And then he'd go home at night and write about a man who turns into, a non-human creature, a bug.
That schedule, that contrast.
Yeah.
It must have been just a crushing physical and psychological drain.
It really was. Reports say he often worked a relentless schedule, sometimes like 8 in the morning right through till 6 in the evening, and he deeply, deeply resented it.
You can imagine.
His father, Herman, who we'll probably talk more about, famously dismissed this insurance job as a Brotberuf.
A bread job.
Yeah, literally a bread job. A job you do purely to pay the bills, just to survive. And for Kafka, this professional duty, this obligation, it was in direct brutal conflict with what he called his only desire and my only calling, which is literature.
So he felt his true self, his essential being, was wrapped up in literature, but the world was demanding his time for calculating accident payouts.
Exactly. That internal war, that tension between his duty and his calling, it really feels like the engine driving the metamorphosis, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And you mentioned his father. We can't really talk about Kafka's psychological state, his torment maybe, without digging into that relationship, right?
No, you really can't. The relationship with his father, Herman, it casts this huge shadow over his entire life and certainly over his work. Herman was, by all accounts, a successful businessman, but also very overbearing authoritarian.
The classic difficult father figure.
Very much so. Kafka felt constantly judged, oppressed even by this powerful figure. He tried to articulate all this anguish in that incredibly long, famously unsent letter to his father.
And it sounds like his home life basically set up that foundational sense of arbitrary, maybe unforgiving authority that just permeates his fiction.
Absolutely. That authority figure who judges you, but maybe without clear cause, who holds all the power, that's central to Kafka. The strained dynamic, it's not just subtly there in Metamorphosis where the father's reaction to Gregor is, well, harsh. Yeah. But it's also really explicit in other stories, like The Judgment. In that one, the son is literally condemned to death by his dominant father. So, while his friends apparently found Kafka witty, profound, maybe with a dry sense of humor internally, his diaries show a different picture.
What do they show?
They show someone very self-analytic, as one source puts it, and just perpetually tortured by fear, by doubt, really wrestling with himself.
He had this huge inner world, didn't he? Just struggling to get out, but trapped by all the pressures of his external life, his duties.
He captured that struggle so well in his diary. There's a famous quote, "The tremendous world I have inside my head, but how to free myself and free it without being torn to pieces.
Wow.
And 1,000 times rather be torn to pieces than retain it in me or bury it. That, indeed, is why I am here. That is quite clear to me." You see, for him, writing wasn't just telling stories. It was almost an escape, a necessity. He even called it a form of prayer.
A form of prayer. That's powerful. And sadly, his life was tragically short, plagued by ill health towards the end.
Yes, he was diagnosed with laryngeal tuberculosis back in 1917. And the disease eventually took his life, very young, only age 40, in 1924.
And there's that heartbreaking detail about his final days, right?
Yeah, it's this incredibly poignant, almost symmetrical detail. He was actually editing his final story, A Hunger Artist, literally on his deathbed.
A Hunger Artist.
Yeah.
Tell me about that one.
It's a story about a man who, well, starves himself for art as a performance. And he ultimately dies because his throat closes up. He can no longer ingest any nourishment. So Kafka was quite literally editing a narrative about a fatal physical blockage while his own throat was closing up due to the tuberculosis.
That's almost too perfectly, terribly Kafkaesque in itself. Wow. Okay, that context really sets the stage perfectly, doesn't it? You see a man who is already kind of psychologically alienated maybe before you even put pen to paper on Metamorphosis.
Definitely.
So let's shift now. Let's get into the deep dive proper, into those 4 major existential themes within the novella itself. Where should we start?
Let's start with alienation, because it feels so immediate in this story. In philosophical terms, Gregor's physical change, that sudden grotesque shift into a bug, it's not really the cause of his alienation. It's more like the perfect, inescapable symbol of it.
A symbol of what was already there.
Exactly. A symbol of a deeper pre-existing disconnect. Mental, emotional. We know he hated his job, right? Hated being a traveling salesman. The monotony, the pressure.
Yeah, the text makes that pretty clear early on. I remember the sources connecting this feeling to philosophers like Heidegger and even Marx. How does Gregor fit into that sort of framework? Alienation in the money-driven world.
Well, think about how alienation is defined, especially in a capitalist or highly structured society. For someone like Marx, it's about alienation from the product of your labor, right? You make something, but it's not yours. Alienation from the process of labor itself, it's repetitive, dehumanizing, and alienation from other people. Gregor, as a traveling salesman, he embodies this almost perfectly. His work is monotonous, it's soul-crushing, and he's constantly moving. He's disconnected from any real community, any home base. He's basically just an instrument of commerce.
A cog, like we said, but a constantly moving cog.
Yeah.
Never really rooted anywhere.
Precisely. And then you have someone like Heidegger who talks about Dasein being in the world and this idea of being thrown into the world without any real explanation or choice.
Thrownness.
Yeah, thrownness. Gregor is thrown into a job he despises purely to fulfill obligations, paying off his parents' debt, meeting family expectations. He likely already felt like a stranger to himself, living what Heidegger might call an inauthentic existence.
So the transformation into the bug, it's just the physical world finally catching up to his internal state, making it visible.
That's a great way to see it. It's the ultimate visible form of his alienation. His internal reality, interestingly, remains stubbornly human, at least at first. He's worrying about catching the train, about his job, about the rent.
Right, the practical stuff.
But his exterior, his body, it's a total rejection. It denies him any normal social or familial recognition. The source material really highlights the sheer physical impotence he feels. There's that line.
Hold on.
He would have used his arms and his hands to push himself up, but instead of them, he only had all those little legs continuously moving in different directions. That loss of bodily control, that sense of his limbs having a will of their own. It's the ultimate signal of being detached. From himself, from others. His body is no longer his reliable tool for engaging with the world. It's become an obstacle, a prison.
And the change in his societal status, his value to the family, that shifts instantly too, right?
Oh,
that's brutal.
Instantaneous and absolutely crushing. His status shifts the very moment the income stops flowing. Before the change, remember, he was the sole breadwinner. He was the pillar holding up the family structure, maybe even revered, but primarily for his transactional worth.
Because he brought home the money.
Exactly. The moment he could no longer provide that, the second the transaction stopped, he became useless. Worse than useless, actually. A burden, a source of shame. The physical horror of the bug, in some ways, seems secondary to the functional horror of him being financially worthless.
So his isolation just deepens and deepens because his worth was always defined by his ability to earn, not by, who he was intrinsically.
Precisely. He's alienated not just from his own body, but from the entire economic structure that had defined his existence up to that point. It's a total system collapse for him.
Okay, so if alienation covers his physical and economic state, let's move to that second major theme you mentioned, absurdity. Albert Camus is sort of the go-to figure here, right? How does Gregor's transformation, his cockroach body, manage to encapsulate this whole concept of the absurd?
Well, Camus defined the absurd as that fundamental conflict, that clash between humanity's deep-seated, innate, desperate need for rational purpose, for meaning, for order, and the universe's response, which is basically profound silence, static, aloof indifference.
We scream for answers, and the universe just shrugs.
Pretty much, yeah. We demand meaning, structure, explanations, and the universe offers only randomness, indifference. And Kafka, he achieves this sense of the absurd so brilliantly in Metamorphosis precisely because he refuses to give us a reason for the transformation.
Right. That's key, isn't it? He never explains why it happened.
Never. There's no scientific diagnosis offered, no magic spell, no psychological trauma pinpointed as the trigger, no divine punishment. It just happens. One morning, he wakes up like that, end of story, or rather, beginning of story.
And that refusal to explain, it forces both the reader and Gregor himself to confront the sheer, unreasonableness of his existence.
Exactly. His predicament violently attacks everything we normally assume as logical or reasonable about cause and effect in the world. It's fundamentally absurd.
Now, it feels important here to maybe distinguish Camus's idea of the absurd from pure nihilism. A nihilist would just say, okay, nothing matters, so what? Does Gregor become a nihilist? Does he just give up on meaning entirely?
That's an excellent point and a really critical distinction to make. No, Gregor doesn't become a nihilist, and that's precisely what makes his situation truly profoundly absurd in the Camusian sense.
Okay, explain that.
Nihilism suggests a total surrender to meaninglessness, just giving up. The absurd, as Camus defined it, actually requires acknowledging the meaninglessness, the silence of the universe, while still striving, still searching for human connection, for value, even in the face of that indifference. It's about the tension, the struggle itself.
So even though he's physically become this vermin, does he retain some kind of human essence that still strives, that still seeks connection or meaning?
Yes, and this is where we find that key philosophical nugget in the text, what you might call the absurd contradiction. Kafka brilliantly highlights this violent clash between Gregor's retained human feelings, his emotional resonance, and his external, dehumanized insect form.
You mean like the scene with the music?
Exactly that scene. The source material emphasizes it strongly. It's when his sister, Greet, is playing the violin in the other room.
Yes. That scene is incredibly haunting. It stays with you.
It really does. Gregor is literally drawn out of his room, risking exposure, risking rejection again, simply because the music affects him so deeply. He's moved. He clings to this feeling, this memory, this connection to beauty. He thinks about his sister, about their shared past, maybe even dreams of sending her to the conservatory.
Human thoughts, human feelings.
Absolutely. And then the narrative poses that agonizing question, the one that perfectly summarizes the absurd dilemma he's trapped in. Was he an animal that music could move him so?
Right. That question just hangs there. It's the absolute heart of the absurd conflict. He looks like a monster, a pest, but he feels the transcendent pull of art, of beauty.
He does. He possesses this undeniably human inner life, a soul, if you want to call it that, capable of responding to something beyond mere physical need, despite his repulsive exterior. The absurd arises because his subjective, profoundly human experience being moved by music conflicts so sharply, so irreconcilably with the indifferent, even hostile external reality.
Which is his family seeing him, screaming, driving him back into his room.
Exactly. He cannot bridge that gap between his inner self and the outside world's perception of him. And it's this continued, futile striving for connection, for dignity, for meaning, in the face of that overwhelming indifference and rejection. That's the essence of the absurd life, according to Camus. And Gregor is living it, or rather, dying it.
Okay, let's just transition now to the third theme you laid out, identity crisis. It really seems like Kafka is arguing that Gregor's identity crisis wasn't actually caused by the transformation, but maybe just finalized by it, exposed by it.
Absolutely. That's a perfect way to put it. The crisis was already brewing. It was rooted in his failure, or maybe his inability, to establish an authentic identity before he became a bug.
How does existentialism frame that?
Well, there's that core existentialist idea often associated with Sartre. Existence precedes essence, meaning you were born, you exist, and then, through your choices, your actions, your commitments, you define your purpose, your essence, you create who you are.
But Gregor didn't do that.
Not really. Gregor's pre-metamorphosis identity seems entirely defined by external factors, things easily measured by others. His job title, traveling salesman. His function, repaying the family debt. His role, dutiful son and brother. He essentially adopted an essence that was assigned to him by others, based largely on his economic contribution.
So he became what he did for others, rather than doing what he chose to be for himself.
Precisely. His value, his sense of self-worth, it seems, was directly correlated with the size of his paycheck and how quickly he could pay off that debt. So when the transformation happens, it instantly eliminates his ability to perform that function, to play that role.
It pulls the rug out from under his entire identity structure.
Completely. The physical change literally obliterates the foundation of who he thought he was, or at least who everyone else told him he was. It forces him, or should force him, to confront the emptiness that was maybe always there, beneath the facade of the reliable salesman, the dutiful son.
But he struggles with that confrontation, doesn't he? He seems to rely desperately on getting external validation, even after he's become physically grotesque. Which leads us to that moment the sources called the false hope. Can you unpack that?
Yes, this is a really crucial and frankly heartbreaking little nugget in the story. Gregor experiences these brief, fleeting moments where he convinces himself that the family is starting to accept him again, even in his new form.
Like when Greet shows him a little kindness.
Exactly. Maybe she leaves him a dish of milk and scraps that he actually likes, or maybe his parents cast what he interprets as a concerned glance his way. And in those moments, he leaps to this conclusion, this false hope. The text says something like, he felt integrated into the family circle again, and from the 2 loving glances he received, he believed that the worst was over.
Oh, that's just devastating. Because as the reader, you know the worst has barely even begun for him.
Yeah.
He's desperate for the family to basically reassign him some kind of value, even though he can't bring in money anymore.
Yes. His desperate reliance on outside approval, on those 2 loving glances, it just demonstrates his fundamental confusion about his own selfhood, his own identity. He's basing his entire sense of potential future identity on a completely misinterpreted, untrue sense of acceptance.
Clinging to the old rules, the old way of being valued.
He is. He's clinging to outdated roles and refusing to accept the stark reality. He must now define himself anew. Independently of them. He never seems to consider defining his new identity as, I don't know, the thinking bug or the observer or the philosopher trapped in the corner.
No, he only clings to the idea of being the provider who will surely recover someday.
Which is impossible. And that inability, or maybe unwillingness to redefine himself, to embrace the terrifying freedom of his new situation, that flows directly into our final theme, the most complex one perhaps, freedom and bad faith.
Right, because strangely, paradoxically, the transformation actually grants him immense freedom, doesn't it?
It's the ultimate paradox of the story, yeah. The change separates him completely, violently from his former life. It breaks him free from all those crushing social obligations he hated.
No more train schedules, no more dealing with annoying clients.
Exactly. He no longer has to labor, travel, worry about money, follow social rules or decorum. This is, in a profound, almost metaphysical sense, existential freedom. The raw, terrifying power to choose freely and accept accountability for those choices, unburdened by past duties or societal expectations.
But he doesn't use it. He doesn't seem to choose anything new for himself. He just obsesses over the identity he's lost.
And that is precisely where Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith, mauvaise foi, comes sharply into focus. Sartre defined bad faith as this act of self-deception. It's when people deny their radical freedom, their terrifying liberty, and their personal accountability, choosing instead to hide within predetermined societal roles, acting as if those roles were fixed, like destiny.
Okay, but how does this apply to Gregor? I mean, isn't it a bit unfair to accuse a creature who is physically trapped, immobilized in many ways, of acting in bad faith by not exercising freedom?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And that's part of what makes Kafka so brilliant and unsettling. The freedom we're primarily talking about here isn't just physical mobility, though he does have some, crawling on walls and ceilings. It's metaphysical liberty, freedom from expectation.
Freedom from the role of provider.
Yes. He is free from the expectation of labor. He can choose to define himself as something other than the debt payer. He has the internal space, the time, the lack of external demands to potentially do that. Yet, what does he do? He continues to cling desperately to his past role as the provider, even as he's literally decaying in his room.
Is there a specific textual example that really shows this bad faith in action?
Yes, the source material points to his internal monologue, where he almost rationalizes his current suffering by constantly focusing on his former contribution. He thinks back and feels proud that he'd been able to provide such a life and so beautiful an apartment for his parents and sister.
Ah, okay. Focusing on past glories to avoid the present horror.
Exactly. That pride and now impossible duty, that dwelling on a role he can no longer fulfill. That's the core of his bad faith. He's actively refusing to acknowledge the present reality, including his terrifying ability, or maybe responsibility, to define a new identity within this horrific situation. He's hiding in the psychological comfort, however flimsy, of a bygone role.
So he's essentially choosing not to confront his current terrible freedom, because confronting it would mean...
It would mean accepting the absurdity, the meaninglessness, perhaps, of his transformation. It would mean accepting that he is now something utterly different. And it would mean accepting that his continued suffering, his isolation, is, in some profound existential sense, a choice. A choice to deny his new state of being. A choice to remain mentally trapped in the past.
Wow.
By clinging so fiercely to the role of the provider, he's refusing the burden of defining himself as the free, grotesque, possibly thinking creature he has become.
So paradoxically, his newfound liberty, instead of leading to some kind of liberation or new understanding, actually becomes this malicious force, as one source put it, driving him deeper into isolation and ultimately towards death.
That's the tragic endpoint of this particular existential vision in the story. His experience demonstrates the sheer insufficiency, maybe even the danger, of human freedom when it slams up against profound absurdity and physical limitation, because he cannot use that freedom to build a new, authentic self, or to somehow maintain meaningful human connections despite his form. It simply accelerates his misery. It leads him down a path of increasing isolation, self-deception, and eventual surrender to death. Utterly alone.
It's just incredible, the profound power of Kafka's analysis of the human condition.
Yeah.
It absolutely ensured his lasting legacy. Yet the very fact that we can even sit here and discuss these works today is down to an incredible act of, well, disobedience, isn't it?
It really is. It's the dramatic and ethically complex story of Max Brod. Brod was Kafka's closest friend, his confidant, and eventually his literary executor.
And Kafka left very specific instructions for him. Yeah.
Extremely specific. Kafka was intensely self-critical, maybe pathologically so. He left explicit, unambiguous instructions in what's often called his last request. Everything he left behind, diaries, manuscripts, letters, sketches, and crucially, the unfinished novels should be burned unread.
Burned unread. That is the ultimate ethical nightmare for a literary executor, surely. Do you honor the explicit wishes of the deceased author, your friend? Or do you preserve what you firmly believe to be world-changing genius for posterity?
It's a profound conflict, absolutely. And Broad, utterly convinced of Kafka's genius and historical importance, chose to betray his friend's final wishes.
How did he justify that?
Well, his argument later was that he had actually told Kafka during his lifetime that he would never carry out such a destructive request. He argued that Kafka knew his position and should have appointed a different executor if he was absolutely determined to have the works destroyed. Whether Kafka truly accepted that, we'll never know.
So Broad saved everything.
He did. He saved the manuscripts, famously fleeing Prague with them in a suitcase in 1939, just ahead of the Nazis, escaping to Palestine. And then, after the war, he began the process of editing and publishing the core novels, The Trial, The Castle, America, mostly between 1925 and 1935. And that's what really catapulted Kafka to posthumous international fame.
So we basically owe the entire Kafka canon, everything beyond the few stories published in his lifetime, to one man's decision to value the art over the artist's explicit will.
Yeah.
That's staggering. And that decision, that act of preservation, it continues to reveal new things about Kafka even now, doesn't it?
It does, yes. Just recently, in 2023, new unexpurgated editions of Kafka's diaries were published, based on manuscripts recovered after a long legal battle following Broad's death.
Unexpurgated, meaning Broad had cut things out.
Exactly. These new editions revealed that Broad, while saving the bulk of the work, had previously edited out certain details he presumably found sensitive or perhaps damaging to Kafka's image at the time. Specifically, things like homoerotic references and also some of Kafka's more negative, sometimes quite harsh, generalized comments about other groups, like Eastern European Jews.
Wow. So Broad wasn't just a preserver, he was also kind of a shaper of Kafka's initial public persona.
Absolutely. It demonstrates his complicated role. He saved the work, but he also curated it, at least initially. It adds another layer to the whole legacy.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about those other major works that Broad saved, the ones that really cemented Kafka's reputation, particularly those two great unfinished novels that just perfectly capture that feeling of struggling against some vast, incomprehensible machine.
You mean The Trial and the Castle?
Exactly. Let's start with The Trial.
Okay. In The Trial, the protagonist, Joseph K., a bank official, is arrested one morning. He's prosecuted by this shadowy, remote, seemingly all-powerful bureaucratic authority. But here's the thing. He's arrested for a crime he apparently never committed. And crucially, the nature of the crime itself is never, ever revealed to him or the reader.
So the whole novel is about his futile attempt to navigate a system whose rules are unknown, whose logic is arbitrary, whose authority is absolute but inaccessible.
Precisely. It's the definitive nightmare of modern bureaucracy, of inscrutable systems of power. The process is the punishment.
Chilling. And then there's The Castle. Similar themes, but maybe a slightly different angle.
Yes. In The Castle, the protagonist is known only as K. He arrives in a village blanketed in snow, dominated by a mysterious castle on a hill. He claims to be a land surveyor summoned by the castle authorities, but he struggles relentlessly and completely fruitlessly just to gain access, to make contact with the officials inside.
He's trying to get recognition, to get his job confirmed.
Exactly. He's trying to establish his legal right to live and work in the village, a right supposedly granted by the castle. But every effort he makes, every attempt to communicate, every application, every interaction with the villagers, who are supposedly intermediaries, is met with confusion, delay, bureaucratic absurdity, and endless obstruction. He's constantly striving, but never arriving.
And the intended ending for the castle, which Kafka apparently described abroad, it just perfectly sums up this whole bureaucratic futility, doesn't it?
It's classic, grimly ironic Kafka. His plan, apparently, was that K would continue his struggle for years, grow old in the village, still trying to reach the castle, and then finally, on his deathbed, a message would arrive from the castle.
What would it say?
It would notify him that. Well, although his legal claim to live in the village was actually invalid, and all his efforts were technically meaningless, nevertheless, considering certain circumstances, he was now granted permission to live and work there.
Permission granted only at the very moment it becomes utterly useless.
Exactly. The ultimate bureaucratic anticlimax. Permission arrives only when life itself is ending. It's permission to die there, essentially.
This pervasive sense of incomprehensibility of fighting fog, it's heightened by Kafka's actual writing style, isn't it? People talk about his clear, precise German prose, which somehow makes the absurdity even sharper. But it also presents huge challenges for translators, right?
Oh, absolutely. The translation problems are almost part of the philosophical puzzle with Kafka. On the one hand, yes, his German is often described as very clear, precise, almost legalistic at times. He uses these long, complex sentences where the main verb might be held right until the very end, which creates suspense and demands sustained attention from the reader. That's hard enough to replicate well in English.
But it's more than just sentence structure.
Yes, the real philosophical depth often lies in the deliberate ambiguity of his key vocabulary. The choices he makes for certain words are incredibly loaded.
Okay, let's go back to that word for Gregor's new form in Metamorphosis. You mentioned it earlier.
Ungeziefer. Right, so translators usually default to insect or maybe vermin or sometimes even cockroach, though Kafka never specifies the exact creature. But the German word Ungeziefer carries a much heavier moral and historical weight.
How so?
It literally means vermin or pest, implying something unclean, something to be eradicated. But crucially, its roots, back in Middle High German, the term literally meant an animal unclean for sacrifice, impure, unfit for sacred rites.
Ah, so Kafka wasn't interested in a precise scientific classification.
Yeah.
He wanted to immediately signal disgust and rejection.
Exactly. He wasn't writing entomology. He wanted to convey moral disgust, social rejection, a sense of contamination. By choosing Ungeziefer, he immediately links Gregor's physical state to his perceived moral status in the eyes of his family and society. He is repulsive, unworthy, spiritually unclean.
That makes the family's horrified reaction feel less about just, oh no, a giant bug, and more about their immediate classification of him as something fundamentally vile, something that doesn't belong in the human sphere.
Absolutely. The disgust is almost preemptive, coded into the very word used to describe him. And there's another really famous linguistic nugget involving ambiguity in the final sentence of The Judgment, that story where the father condemns the son.
Okay, what's the word there?
The story ends with the son, Georg, accepting his father's death sentence and rushing out to drown himself. The very last line describes the flow of traffic over the bridge he jumps from using the German noun Verkehr.
Verkehr. What does that mean?
Well, here's the thing. Verkehr certainly can mean traffic, like cars or people moving. That's its most common meaning today. But it also means intercourse or dealings or communication in both the social sense and potentially the physical, sexual sense as well.
Whoa. Okay, that's a radical ambiguity right at the climax of the story. It creates completely different potential readings of his final action.
It really does. Is the son rushing out into the impersonal traffic of the city, overwhelmed by life? Or is he rushing, perhaps, to violently stop the intercourse of his own life, his connections, his very being? And that ambiguity is made even more intense by Kafka's private confession to Max Brod.
What did he confess?
He apparently told Brod that when he wrote that final line, he was thinking of a violent ejaculation.
Wow.
So these loaded double meanings, these carefully chosen ambiguities, ensure that Kafka's seemingly clean, straightforward prose is actually saturated with psychological weight, unresolved tension, and meaning that the reader has to grapple with. It demands critical engagement.
Which brings us, I suppose, to his ultimate popular legacy, the term Kafkaesque. We hear it thrown around a lot in modern conversation, sometimes maybe a bit casually. What's the proper scholarly definition we should probably try to stick to?
Right. The Kafkaesque generally describes situations that feel reminiscent of his literary world. Typically, this involves isolated protagonists who find themselves facing bizarre, surreal, often threatening predicaments. And crucially, these predicaments are defined by incomprehensible, impersonal, often hostile socio-bureaucratic powers.
So getting lost in endless paperwork loops in the DMV could be Kafkaesque.
It could have elements of it, yes. The term has definitely transcended literature to describe those kinds of complex, illogical, frustrating, nightmarish real-life processes. Trying to navigate an insurance claim, appealing a decision based on rules you didn't know existed and can't seem to clarify. That feels Kafkaesque to many people.
But the sources caution that the phrase is often misused, right?
Yeah.
To just mean any kind of bureaucratic hassle or general unpleasantness. What's the critical nuance we need to remember?
The nuance really lies in the protagonist's attitude, their response within that situation. A truly Kafkaesque scenario isn't just about the nightmare itself, it's about the continued, desperate, often futile effort of the individual caught within that nightmare.
The striving.
Exactly. At its core, Kafkaesque involves striving even in the face of bleakness, hopelessly and full of hope, as one critic put it. Joseph K. doesn't just give up in the trial. He keeps trying to understand, to fight his case, even though the system is designed to prevent that. Kay in the castle never abandons his pursuit, however doomed it seems. It's that relentless tenacity against an indifferent or hostile universe that truly defines the term, not just the weirdness, but the persistent human struggle against it.
That makes sense. And this utterly unique style, this worldview, it's influenced just huge figures across the arts, hasn't it? Connecting directly back to all the themes we've been discussing.
The influence is immense, almost hard to overstate. He's been called things like the Dante of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You have writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who famously cited reading the Metamorphosis as the pivotal moment that showed him that it was possible to write in a different way. It basically opened the door for magical realism by normalizing the seamless integration of the absurd into reality.
And the philosophers.
Oh, absolutely. He profoundly influenced the existentialists we've mentioned, like Sartre and Camus. They saw his narratives as perfect fictional embodiments of the philosophical problems they were grappling with: alienation, absurdity, freedom, responsibility. They used his work to frame and illustrate their theories.
And culturally, the echo seems almost limitless.
It really feels that way. You see it in writers who followed, from Nabokov, who admired his precision, to Milan Kundera, who explored similar themes of identity and oppressive systems culturally. Well, films that explore that sense of bureaucratic dread, individual helplessness. Think Orson Welles' stark 1962 film version of The Trial, or Terry Gilliam's darkly funny Brazil. Those are direct cinematic translations of the Kafkaesque sensibility.
Even in music.
Even in music. Apparently, Robert Smith of The Cure cited Kafka's intense, anguished letters to Felice as a key inspiration for their song A Letter to Elise. So his work isn't just dusty old literature, it's become part of the very vocabulary we use to describe and maybe cope with modern alienation and absurdity.
So as we start to wrap up our deep dive here, it feels like we've moved way past the simple surface horror of a man turning into an insect. We've seen that Franz Kafka's literature, especially the Metamorphosis, is this incredibly powerful engine for exploring fundamental existential questions. Questions about purpose, about alienation, about identity.
Yeah, Kafka really distilled the profound isolation and the absurdity he clearly felt in his own life, that conflict between his day job, his duty, and his true creative calling, and he magnified it into the figure of Gregor Samsa. Through Gregor's transformation, and maybe more importantly, his reaction to it, Kafka demonstrates that agonizing, often futile effort of trying to live authentically or even just survive with dignity in a world that seems to only value your transactional worth and offers profound indifference in return.
It really forces you as a reader to question how much of your own identity is maybe derived from these external, easily eliminated roles of your function in a family or society, and maybe how desperately we tend to cling to those roles, even sometimes when they bring us misery, because the alternative seems too terrifying.
Exactly. And for me, what really stands out is that central existential paradox we discussed, the one driven by the concept of bad faith. Kafka uses Gregor's intense misery, a misery that, in a strange way, stems from an unexpected total freedom from his old obligations, to make us wonder about something quite profound.
Which is?
Well, if true freedom, physical, social, maybe even mental freedom, sometimes only comes through a complete, almost violent detachment from the world and its demands, does choosing to live freely in that detached way actually risk driving us away from our basic humanity? Does it leave us more isolated, more alone than we were when we were bound by duty? And if that's the risk, then what is the real value of that kind of radical freedom?
That's a heavy question to end on. Does freedom equal isolation?
It's the dilemma Kafka leaves us with, I think. A question for every listener to maybe grapple with themselves long after the story ends.